going to wrap up Congress today. Okay, we're going to talk about the process of passing legislation, including the steps, various factors that go into it. Also, special powers given to the Senate, some of the issues we see with how Congress is working or not working today. Last class, we talked about committees, personnel, etc. Some of you as a kid may have seen this Schoolhouse Rock video, how a bill gets passed. Okay, so basically a bill can be introduced either in the House or the Senate, with the exception that spending bills can only be introduced in the House. So the budget has to be introduced in the House. It cannot be introduced in the Senate. That's one of the special kind of powers that's given to the House. Once it gets introduced, it goes to the appropriate committee for deliberation. That committee then sends it to a subcommittee, a small section of the full committee, that holds hearings, listens to expert testimony, and amends the legislation before it goes back to the full committee. So when they send it back to the full committee, they can either choose to just accept the changes at those hearings, or they can hold their own hearings and amend the bill themselves. Over 10,000 bills are introduced every single session. 80 to 90% of them die in committee. They die because they're repetitive, or would cost too much money, or maybe they just aren't considered a priority at this time. Most of them, the committee looks at that and goes, nah, and kills it. If they decide to approve a bill, it's then up to the committee to decide if it's an open rule or closed rule discussion. With a closed rule, the time for debate and amendment is severely restricted. In a closed rule, there's very little time for discussion or amendment. In an open rule, there's floor debate and adding of amendments. Most committees prefer closed rule because if you add too many amendments or they're controversial, that can be a way of killing the bill. You don't want someone attacking an amendment that they know no one would vote for. They usually prefer a very limited discussion and amendment process. They don't like a lot of discussion, debate, adding amendments that completely change the nature of the bill. It's important to have these debates. It's important for the members to discuss amongst themselves what they think. Bills can be hundreds of pages, so you need to discuss the key elements so people understand what they're voting for. And it's up to the leadership to decide who gets to speak. So Nancy Pelosi will choose the speakers in the House. Mitch McConnell will choose who gets to speak in the Senate. Usually within the House of Representatives, the rule is that you'll give the most time to the sponsor of the bill and the bill's leading opponent. If someone really wants to speak on a bill, they need to ask the leadership, may I be the person to speak up against this bill? They also tend to set time limits in the House. You have 5 minutes or you have 2 minutes, and they do try to enforce it. They do try to say, after 5 minutes, your time is up, that's it. We have to move on to the next person. In the Senate, they get a special power known as the filibuster. If a senator opposes a bill, he or she can go onto the floor of the Senate and talk and talk and talk in an attempt to get rid of the bill. During a filibuster, they don't have to discuss the legislation. They can talk about whatever they want. They can't sit down. They can't go to the bathroom. They can only drink water, and they can only eat hard candy from the desk of the Pennsylvania senator. Don't ask me why, that's just one of those weird things they did. It goes on as long as you can talk. The longest filibuster ever was in 1957, when Strom Thurmond stood on the Senate floor for 24 hours and 18 minutes to kill a civil rights bill. And it worked. You have to be prepared. You have to keep standing. You cannot sit. You cannot go to the bathroom. You cannot leave the floor. The minute you stop speaking or sit down, it's over. So you got to be prepared to be up there for a while. You're probably going to be wanting to wear a diaper because, again, you can't leave the floor for any reason. So I like to joke that if I was a senator, I'd bring a copy of The Stand by Stephen King. It's 1,400 pages. I could be up there for a while. It would be good. Ted Cruz filibustered reading Green Eggs and Ham. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you're talking about. It just matters what you're talking. You are allowed to yield the floor for a question. So if someone's going on for, let's say, it's been 5 hours, a fellow senator can give them a temporary reprieve. They can sit down while they're being asked a question, but otherwise they can't. They got to keep standing and you got to keep going. There is a way to end a filibuster. If you get 60 senators to say enough of this nonsense, they can vote and they can cut off the debate. Otherwise, they'll have a staff member sitting in the Senate chamber going, let me know when they shut up and we can vote. Again, the minute you stop is the minute the filibuster's over. So they go as long as they can to try and kill a piece of legislation. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. It just depends. In both chambers, there's going to be amendments added to a bill, and you have to vote on these bills before you can vote on the bill overall. It has to be unanimous consent to end the amendment process. So this is where we get the short barrel legislation coming in, that $2 million amendment for a new park, or $2 billion to build a bridge in the middle of nowhere in Alaska. This is where all these little projects get added. We kind of call it like the ornament process, hanging an ornament off of the tree. We're just adding more and more pieces to the bill. The Senate also has the power of a hold. If a senator doesn't like a bill, but is afraid that their opposition would be unpopular, they can place an anonymous hold on a bill for up to 6 days. After the 6th day, they have to identify themselves in the congressional record and state why they placed the hold on it. So it can't be indefinite. And they do this because after 6 days, then interest groups know who it is. Fellow senators know who it is. And their constituents know who they are. Then they face a lot of pressure to stop their opposition and stop blocking the bill. It's designed to keep a senator from blocking a bill indefinitely, making them have to be responsive and say, look, I oppose this bill and here's why. So they can't hold a piece of legislation forever. And if you ever watch C-SPAN, you can see some of this floor debate in the House and the Senate when they're talking about legislation. Okay, so once they're done adding amendments, once they're done debating, it then has to go to a vote in both chambers. The leadership usually won't allow a vote unless they know the bill is likely to pass. You don't want Nancy Pelosi saying, we're going to vote on this, and she doesn't have enough votes. So unless they're about 95% certain it's going to pass, they're not bringing it to the floor. And usually what happens is we get two different versions of the same bill in the House and the Senate. This is where the conference committee comes in and reconciles the differences between the bills. Tries to create a version that incorporates the text of both bills, but also gets rid of any redundancies. They have to work together to create one single bill that can be voted on in the House and the Senate, one unified bill. Then it has to be voted on in the House and the Senate. It only takes a simple majority. It only takes 51 out of 100 senators. You only need about 51%. If the bill passes, it then goes to the president. The president can choose to sign the bill, making it law, or he can choose to veto. If he chooses to veto, he has two options. The first is to send the bill back to the Senate or House unsigned within 10 days of its passage. He can also use the more passive pocket veto. So when Congress adjourns for the holidays in December, for example, the president can choose to just leave the bill on his desk for 10 days because Congress is not in session. So a pocket veto will be used if they don't want to show strong opposition, they just kind of want it to die a natural death. Congress can override a veto. You need a 2/3 majority in the House and a 2/3 majority in the Senate to do so. So it's fairly rare. The last time it happened was in 2016. Congress passed a bill that would allow the families of 9/11 victims to sue the government of Saudi Arabia for its involvement in the 9/11 attack. 15 of the 19 hijackers came from Saudi Arabia, and there's a lot of questions about did they have help from the Saudi Arabian government. President Obama vetoed the bill, and Congress overrode the veto. Here's why he overrode the veto. There's a reciprocity clause in that bill. We can sue Saudi Arabia. Foreign citizens can now sue the U.S. government. The victims of drone strikes in Afghanistan can sue the U.S. government. It's reciprocity. You can sue them, they can sue us. And that's why he vetoed the bill. And Congress didn't seem to understand that. They just saw it as a 9/11 bill. Of course you're going to vote for it. I didn't realize that was what was going to happen. That's why he vetoed it, because he didn't want to open the door for us to be sued for mistakes we've made in the past. But nonetheless, it's there. Open the door for it. Yep. Yeah. Sure.
So you know how Trump put a new girl or a new woman in the position that was it only the one that died?
Yeah, yeah, Barrett, yeah, the new judge, yeah.
So it's just a quick question. If Biden was to get elected, he can't be dismissed her, right?
No.
She's there for life.
She's there for life, unless she gets impeached. Yeah.
That's like a lot of people are like, I'm feeding all over it, everyone's mad.
Yep, nope, he can't do anything about it unless she resigns or is impeached. Yeah, or dies, but it's not likely she'll die for like 40 years or something. So yeah. I don't know. She's not old though.
She doesn't look old. That's why I was
Like in her late 40s, I think, maybe. No. Nope. Yeah, the other thing, and it's not off topic because it does relate to this class. The other thing that they've been talking about is the number of Supreme Court justices is not permanently fixed at 9. It can actually be expanded. So some suggestions have been made, well, if he gets a Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, could he add 3 new seats to the Supreme Court and pack 3 more liberals onto it? Technically, yes.
There's an option. She could be there, but
he could try to change the rules. Yes. Yeah.
I know she's against a lot of things. So
correct. Yeah. Yeah, and so that's why some Democrats are like, Biden had this option, and he's like, I don't know. And I understand his reluctance. But part of me is like, if the other side cheated, change the rules of the game, right? If you don't like if you don't like it, you have the power to change it, technically. I mean, it's not set in stone that there's 9 justices on the court. It used to be 6, now it's 9. It could be 12. Or 11 or 15. I mean, that's up to Congress. So if he really wanted to change the rules, he could. But he has to want to. And he's kind of all that. Yeah. But honestly, I mean, what I would rather see is an ideologically balanced court. 3 conservatives, 3 liberals, 3 moderates, and you have to work with each other. And if a moderate justice dies, replace them with a moderate. Like, ideologically balanced instead of this nonsense about a liberal majority or a conservative majority. The Supreme Court is not supposed to be political. Okay. Congress doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? They're not locked away in Washington, D.C. in isolation from everyone. There's a lot of different influences on how Congress works. We do have some influence on them. If enough of us say to our senators, hey, you know what, you need to pass this bill or else, they're probably going to listen to us, especially during an election year. They're not going to want to tick off their constituents when they're running for re-election. There's also interest groups. The NRA uses a scorecard with a letter grade of A to F. A being someone who's seen as very pro-Second Amendment, F someone seen as hostile to gun rights. And sometimes members of Congress will play up that scorecard. So after the shooting in Parkland, Florida, Congresswoman for the area, W. Wasserman Schultz, talked about how she'd gotten an F rating from the NRA and said, see, look, I'm trying to protect your kids. So she actually used that to her advantage. But usually they want a favorable rating from an organization like the NRA. The AFL-CIO will rank how union-friendly members of Congress are. And the National Right to Life Foundation will rate candidates as pro-life, pro-choice, somewhere in between. So they can use these scorecards or grades to put pressure on the members of Congress to change their actions. They can get members of their group to email or call their Congress members and say, hey, why aren't you looking at this? There's also the role of the party, the fact that members vote with their party over 90% of the time. Within Congress, they have a leadership political action committee to help raise money for each other. If they know a member of Congress is fighting a really tough battle for re-election, they know it's going to be super close, they'll try to raise money to help that member of Congress out. Say, hey, we got your back. Well, we'll try to help you win here. Sometimes it's something as simple as getting the committee that you want. If a senior member of Congress steps up and says, hey, you know what, you really should be on this committee, you may feel obligated. You may feel like, now I owe them something. Now I owe them a yes vote on their bill, or I owe them help on this particular issue. Creating a sense of obligation of, I helped you, now you help me. And of course, interest groups will also run political ads for and against a candidate. I remember seeing an NRA ad in Florida in 2016, and they had this woman home alone at night. Someone's breaking into her house, so she goes to get her gun, and it's on, and it says, Hillary Clinton will leave you defenseless, and it was run by the NRA. It's like, really, you think she's going to take away every gun? But the visual was there, right? People got the visual punch of it, so they will run political ads for certain candidates against them.
I know you said we would take off most of the harmful ads for Trump. Did people do that?
He did for a while when President Trump was fighting COVID, but now that it's back out there, he put them back. Yeah. It was a temporary, like, hey, as a gesture of like, hey, you know, solidarity, sympathy. Yeah, I'm going to pull my ads for a little bit. Yeah.
I haven't seen any, but
I've seen one or two. But yeah, he, out of respect, he pulled the ads, and it was a very classy thing to do. Didn't go over well with some Democrats, but honestly, it was the right thing to do, right? You don't, your opponent, you gotta throw him a bone once in a while. Yeah, I've seen some attack ads, not as many. Although it's interesting, Kamala Harris is coming to McAllen tomorrow. She was supposed to be in Houston, and they rerouted her here. So they're actually looking at the Valley pretty seriously this time around. Yeah.
I saw her the lady was another woman accidentally. I don't know, that it was like, I was like, wow.
Yeah.
That one was probably not in that company.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know if you saw, I think you saw.
Probably, yeah. Yeah. She's tough. I mean, she's known for being tough. Yeah, I think it's interesting that she's coming down here. Right, and this is considered a solidly blue area, so if they can increase turnout here, I'm not saying they're going to flip Texas this time around, but I think it's going to be close. So it'll be interesting, and I think that's why they're starting to pay attention to us down here, finally. It's like, finally, you guys figured out we were here. Yeah, it is kind of cool that she's actually coming down here instead. Okay, another influence is who gets to speak. The leadership gets to decide who gets to speak and for how long. So again, if a Congress member really wants to speak for or against a bill, they've got to get leadership to give them the time. So they may have to engage in some horse trading, some promise making, things like that. Then, of course, you've got the whip system. Then you don't want to bring a bill to the floor unless you know it's going to pass. So Nancy Pelosi doesn't want to say, oh, we'll vote on this bill, and then it dies, right? So she needs the whips to come to her and say, we've got the support, let's move it forward. We're ready to get this out onto the floor for a vote. There's also a little bit of back scratching. You scratch my back, I scratch yours. You owe me a favor. I supported your bill, now it's your turn to support mine. A kind of funny example of this is what they used to call the corn for porn bill, which is misleading because it wasn't actually dealing with pornography. In the early 90s, the National Endowment for the Arts was sponsoring some somewhat controversial art, but that's the nature of the job, is that they do sponsor art that some people find contentious. The senator wanted to defund the NEA, and the supporters were like, how are we going to fix this? So they went to the senators from states like Wyoming and Montana, and they said, let's make a deal. We don't really care about raising fees for livestock. We don't really care about the NEA. If you vote to keep the NEA funded, we'll vote to keep the grazing fees low for your constituents. So both sides reached a deal, and both sides won. So you'll see that happening. Two senators who couldn't care less about the other's bill, but what the hell, right? I can vote for that, sure. We'll support each other. And it also helps if the president and Congress leadership are working together. President Obama made it very clear to the Democrats in 2010 that he wanted the Affordable Care Act. So Democrats were like, well, we can't go against our president. Even if they didn't really love the Affordable Care Act, they were definitely going to vote for it. They weren't going to irritate their president. This is only likely to happen if the president and the majority party in both chambers are from the same party. Right now, that's not happening. Usually, if it's not a divided executive legislative, they can work together to get things done.
Right now,
No, it's okay.
What's the majority right now?
So Democrats have the majority in the House, Republicans have the majority in the Senate. That's why they're not getting the damn thing done. Yeah. It's a very close majority in the Senate for Republicans, and there's at least 4 elections that are really close. The Democrats could theoretically take control of the Senate.
Right now, it's like half and half.
Yeah.
The Democrats are leaning more towards.
Yeah.
How many years Trump was president?
That happens. After 2010, Obama was president, but Republicans controlled Congress.
Oh,
so, yeah, it happens. It happens quite a bit, actually. Usually, for whatever reason, halfway through a president's term, people get irritated with the president's party and vote people out. So, hypothetically, there's a couple of different outcomes for this election. President Trump could win re-election, and Democrats could take Congress. President Trump could win re-election, Democrats could hold on to the House and Republicans to the Senate. Biden could become president and Democrats take control of the House and the Senate. Or Biden becomes president, Democrats control the House, Republicans control the Senate. Like a game of musical chairs with Congress. We have no idea exactly how this is going to go. Yeah. Yeah, it's easier when they're all on the same page. But there's a Senate seat in Arizona that for the first time in God knows how long could potentially go to the Democrats. So they're seeing a lot of funky things happening this time around. part of it is people don't necessarily like the senator in Arizona, and her opponent is very popular. He's Mark Kelly. He used to be an astronaut, so he has a lot of cool points for that. And his wife is Congresswoman Gabrielle Giffords, the one who was shot in the head and almost died in Arizona. And so, because she's so badly injured, she can't run for office anymore, so he's for office. So that's definitely part of it, right? People are looking at that and they're like, oh yeah, she was very well liked in her district. Yeah, and also people were horrified that someone would just walk up and shoot a congresswoman in the head. Like, you just don't do that, right? Yeah, she barely survived, and they killed like 2 members of her staff. This guy just walked up to her event in Arizona and shot her in the head. Yeah, and it's why she's no longer able to serve in office. She had to learn to walk again and talk, and yeah, it's been an uphill battle. And her husband had like no interest in politics until this happened, and now he's like, now I want to run for office. For her and for other victims of gun violence, yeah, yeah. Okay, yeah, Congress. Oh God. Okay. 113th and 112th congressional sessions, least productive in modern history. Not exactly something they should be proud of. And in 2013, it got so bad that only 9% of the public actually was happy with the job Congress was doing. Part of that was because of the shutdown in 2013. Every year, Congress has to pass a spending bill to keep the government open. If they don't pass a funding bill, there's no money, and the government has to shut down. In 2013, House Republicans said, we're not voting for the funding bill unless you delay the rollout of the Affordable Care Act. And Democrats said, but it's the law. Why should we delay this even further? So the government shut down for about 2 weeks. And the public blamed the Republicans and basically said, knock it the hell off. And so eventually they're forced to compromise and just reopen the government. In 2018, President Trump wanted more money for the border wall in the budget. Democrats said no, and the government was shut down for about a month. Government shutdowns are ridiculously expensive. Federal workers are not paid during a shutdown. The military gets paid except for the Coast Guard. But all other federal employees, they don't get paid during a shutdown. So members of TSA were being required to show up to work with no pay. Which is why eventually TSA agents started calling out sick at the major airports, and they had to shut down terminals in New York, Miami, and Dallas. Because why are you going to show up to work if you're not getting paid? And so some TSA agents were getting side gigs in security, and they're like, I'm going where I'm getting paid, I'm out of here. So it was incredibly expensive because there wasn't the money going into the economy. It was during the holidays, which is the busiest time at the airport, so it was a really, really bad situation. Eventually, President Trump was forced to back off, and the government reopened. But the really crappy thing is, Congress still gets paid even if it shuts down the government. So even if they're responsible for the government shutdown, they still get their percent salary, which is ridiculous when you think about it. There's just not a lot of bipartisanship anymore. You don't see co-sponsoring of legislation. You don't see the minority party getting involved in the vote. There's also been this weird thing where there's been this movement by conservatives within the Republican Party to say, you're not a true Republican unless you're conservative. But of course, to the moderate Republicans, they're like, what the hell, like, we still exist. Yeah.
I'll say like, I like, to bring religion to it too, that
Yeah.
you're not a real Christian if you're not public.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah. Yes, yeah, exactly, like, religion should no rule in politics whatsoever, here we are. Yeah, and it doesn't help that moderate Republicans are punished by the conservatives if they try to be cooperative. John Boehner actually was willing to work with President Obama. He said, look, he's the president, we have to work with him. So the really conservative Republicans said, the hell with that, rebelled against Boehner, wouldn't do their jobs. He stepped down as Speaker of the House. Ryan came in and nothing got done after that. He got punished for being willing to work with the president, which is the role of the Speaker of the House. You don't have to like the president that much, but you should be working with him. Nancy Pelosi should be more willing to work with President Trump. I mean, that's just how it is. You're supposed to do your damn job, is what we pay you for. Yeah, I mean, like, you can't process student loans, you can't process Social Security, VA benefits, all of that disappears. Yeah. It was scary. I had a friend who worked for TSA, and they kept asking her to show up to work, and she's like, how am I supposed to buy gas money? I'm not getting paid. And then what happens is they do give them retroactive pay for the shutdown. Then they get taxed on that retroactive pay. They don't actually make that much money even when they get the back pay. It's frustrating because you're like, what the hell are you people doing? You get nothing. Yeah. And it's like, how are you supposed to afford daycare? How are you supposed to afford gas, transportation? I mean, why would you go into work if you're not getting paid? You wouldn't. Right? You're just gonna be like, I'm out of here. I'm sick. Cough, cough. Yeah, I just can't come into work today. Congress, in addition to legislation, does have some ability to try and take action against the executive branch. If the head of an agency is not doing their job, they can take a look at that. And the various committees can subpoena witnesses and compel testimony, and they can bring criminal charges. If someone doesn't show up when subpoenaed, that's contempt of Congress, and they can be put in jail. Same with perjury. If you lie to Congress, you can go to jail. So if Congress subpoenas somebody, they damn well better show up. They better not lie to Congress, because they can throw you in jail, and they will throw you in jail. They're also, of course, in charge of the money that each agency gets. Homeland Security puts together a budget. The Congress says, yeah, that seems reasonable, or yeah, you got to slash it a little bit. Unfortunately, these investigations have become very, very partisan by nature. Congress spent a lot of time looking into Benghazi. It was important to understand what happened there. But at the end of the day, all they really discovered is we missed some information, but there was no conspiracy to cover anything up. The Secretary of State didn't mislead people. It wasn't the big scandal they all thought it was going to be. They didn't spend enough time on Abu Ghraib. You guys may be a little too young to remember this, but Abu Ghraib was a prison in Iraq. And when the U.S. military invaded Iraq, they took over the prison. And in 2004, I believe it was, 2004, 2005, photos and videos of American soldiers abusing the prisoners became public, urinating on prisoners, simulating drowning or electroshock, forcing them to perform sex acts on each other. One photo of an American soldier dragging a detainee down the hall with a dog leash around his neck. And Congress only spent 12 hours investigating this. The military actually spent more time and punished more people for what happened to them. That would be great. A little bit, yeah. American soldiers. And you can see photos of it and stuff. I mean, I don't recommend it, but you can see photos of it. The Stanford prison experiment. Yeah. And there's a lot of criticism of this, the Stanford prison experiment, but it was a very valid proof that too much power in the wrong hands can lead to horrific outcomes. If you let a bunch of soldiers loose in a country, God help us, because you don't know what they're going to do. Kinda, although form of it, yeah. But it's also, it's like, if nobody's paying attention to what's going on, or the people who are in charge aren't actually taking charge, that's a problem. The interesting thing about the Stanford prison experiment, it was run at a college by a psychology professor, Philip Zimbardo. He got caught up in the experiment to the point where he was ignoring the abuse of power, and it took his then girlfriend to tell him, hey, you have to shut this down, it's gone too far. He got caught up in it himself, and he was supposed to be the one that would stop it, and he got so caught up in it that it took someone outside to get him to stop it. He was so caught up in it, yeah, he couldn't see the danger. He was just caught up in it. He was like running it, and he just got so caught up in everything that he just lost perspective. Okay.
Hey, you signed up.
Yeah.
And the guy gets so caught up in it that, like, you scream a safe word, you know it.
Yeah.
That's going on here too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of really interesting psychology behind it. There's the Milgram experiment where people were being subjected to electric shock. The Stanford prison experiment. Yeah, there's a lot of psychology behind what happens if people are allowed to abuse their power with no real checks on it. Yeah. Oh yeah, they can't stop. Yeah, yeah. It's really quite fascinating in a twisted way. Okay. Getting back to Congress and its twisted way. There are special powers that are only granted to the Senate. They have to approve treaties, and they have to approve federal judges, Supreme Court justices, and the various heads of the cabinet. So if hypothetically Joe Biden wins next week, he will nominate secretaries for education, health and human services, homeland security, and so on, and the Senate will have to approve them. Usually it's a pretty straightforward up and down vote. Betsy DeVos as Secretary of Education, that one got contentious, and Mike Pence had to cast a tiebreaker vote because that was bad, but usually it's not like that. We've seen the minority party trying to use the filibuster to block judicial appointments. It hasn't happened as much as it used to, but they do sometimes try to use it. The treaties are complicated, and treaties can take years and years and years for the Senate to approve. For example, in 1948, the United Nations passed the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide that defined what genocide is and what countries should do to stop it. We did not ratify this convention until 1988. It took us 40 years to ratify a genocide convention, which you would think would be the easiest freaking thing to ratify. So if the president doesn't want to wait 40 years, he can enter into what's called an executive agreement. This is where he makes a political, economic, or military agreement with another country that has the power of a treaty but doesn't have to get Senate approval. These are temporary. They are only enforceable as long as that president is in office. The next president can choose to rescind it. But if you're looking to make some kind of deal very quickly, the president will circumvent the Senate, set up an agreement, and live with the fact it may only be enforceable for 4 or 8 years. So an example of this is when we were sending troops to South Vietnam prior to Congress authorizing war in 1964. Sometimes we'll say, you know what, the president will say, I just don't have enough time for you guys to approve an economic treaty. I'm just going to go around you and create an agreement with China or Japan or Democratic Republic of Congo. I mentioned the Democratic Republic of the Congo because the minerals that we find in our cell phones and laptops is tungsten, and most of it is found in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which is in Africa. So that's where we get most of the minerals. Congress also has the power to impeach. What this is essentially charging a president or a government official like a federal judge or a cabinet secretary with treason, bribery, or what the Constitution says are high crimes and misdemeanors. It's a little vague, which isn't necessarily bad because then Congress can look at issues like election tampering or corruption and so on. So if Congress wants to impeach the president, the House of Representatives essentially is the grand jury. They hear testimony, they look at the evidence, and they vote to impeach the president on certain charges. President Clinton was charged by the House with lying under oath and obstruction of justice. If the House votes to impeach, it then goes to the Senate. And the Senate acts as the trial jury. They have to vote on whether or not to convict an official. It does take a 2/3 majority of the senators to convict. So it's not a straight majority vote. Because of this requirement, only 8 individuals have ever been convicted by the Senate. They were all federal judges. And we've had 3 presidents who have been impeached. Andrew Johnson in 1867 was saved by 1 vote in the Senate. Bill Clinton in 1998 for lying to Congress. And President Trump at the beginning of this year, which feels like 5 years ago, for his alleged involvement in asking Ukraine to essentially try to make Joe Biden look bad and engage in voter tampering, election tampering. So of course none of them have been convicted, but they all were. Yeah, the House voted to impeach him, and then because the Republicans controlled the majority of the Senate, it didn't get through the Senate. Yeah. But he is on record as having been impeached by the House. Yeah, with the 2/3 majority, there's no way the Senate was gonna. Yeah.
I know that people are even seeing, well, I don't know if people are even about having there's like some people who are gonna like, I think the mail, but I know it's on Trump's end.
There have been a couple of issues. In Massachusetts, a guy set a ballot box on fire and destroyed hundreds of ballots, so they're trying to replace those. In California, the GOP set up fake voter drop-off boxes and tried to say that the Democrats were engaging in voter fraud, we weren't. And so they've been ordered by a judge to take down these ballot boxes, and so far they've refused. So that is voter tampering. That is voter suppression. If you set up a fake drop-off box and people think it's real, it doesn't get to the polling place on election day. But that is definitely voter tampering. It's coming from the Republican Party and the GOP in California. Yeah. I mean, I don't think he had anything to do with it, but I think the Republican, yeah. Oh yeah, no, it's a huge problem this time around. And actually, a federal judge ordered the Postal Service to speed up the mailing of ballots to make sure they get to the polling place election day. So they've ordered them to do extra shifts, have extra people on. They're like, get the damn thing done. Well, that and what happens if you mail in your ballot and it doesn't get there on November 3rd? It's because of the post office, not you. Then what do, right? Because the voter made a good faith effort to get their ballot there on election day, but it wasn't their fault. Then the courts would have to answer the question of, do we still count these ballots? Do we not? How long do we give them? They're trying to prevent that from happening. It still may happen anyway. I think in Pennsylvania, voters now have until November 6th just to be on the safe side because they don't want people's votes not being counted if they make a good faith effort. But yeah, it's an issue. And there's also been concerns about voter suppression because of the shutting down of polling places in minority districts, which is why we tend to see very long lines in poor areas where people are waiting in line like 5 or 6 hours. So that's a real problem as well. It's always funny with Clinton. I just wanted to go back in time and be like, don't freaking lie to Congress, man. Just come out and say, yes, I had an affair. I'm sorry it happened, and now this is a matter for my family because having an affair is not a crime. Lying about it to Congress, that's a crime. So, one, he should have kept it in his pants. But two, if you're going to have an affair, just freaking tell Congress if they ask you. Don't lie to them. They're not stupid. I know. You'd be amazed how many presidents cheated on their. It's amazing. John Kennedy was one of the worst. Yeah. And I get it. It's like a power thing, but it's like, dude, just come on. Also, don't freaking lie to Congress. Just don't lie to us. It's also interesting because people are looking at it again, and it's like Monica Lewinsky got so much hate and so much bullying for what happened, and it's like, he was the president, she was an intern. It wasn't an equal relationship, so why was she getting all of the crap when he was the one in power, right? If you're looking at it, it's like, they should have been going after him and not her. I mean, I don't care if it's sensual. He was in a position of power over her, and they never should have been going after her as hard as they did. She's not the one who should have been held responsible. Oh, yeah. Yeah, they were making like all these fat jokes and stuff, and I'm like, what the actual hell is wrong with these people? Like, leave her alone. Leave her alone. As a Congress overall, right, they're less effective, they're highly partisan, we're seeing more government shutdowns. What do we do to fix it? Well, how about we stop letting the parties control the districts? How about we set it up so every state uses independent, non-partisan commissions to draw up the districts based on geography? No more packing minorities into districts, no more favoring one party over the other. Make the elections competitive. Stop the nonsense with the parties controlling the districts. That's not how it should be. Some people argue we should end the use of the filibuster in the Senate. That's not likely for two reasons. One, it's in the Constitution, so we have to amend the Constitution. And two, good luck getting the Senate to give up one of its special powers. That ain't happening. They're not going to give that up willingly. So that just doesn't seem like a viable option. We could change the rules and say, it's not enough to get a majority of the votes. It now has to be a bipartisan majority. Because what happens is the party with the most seats just runs through whatever legislation they want without regard for the minority party. So if you said instead, look, you have to get a certain number of Republicans and Democrats to pass this legislation, that could force them to actually start working together. The majority party can't just do whatever it wants. That could force them to actually start working together instead of just going, I'm in charge and too bad for you. Okay, the other thing we can do, and I'm sorry, those of you online, you're not able to see this, sorry, but the other thing that is tossed around is term limits, right? What if we put term limits on Congress? Let's talk about that, right? What would be the advantages of putting term limits on Congress and saying you can only serve so long in office? That's not necessarily the status quo.
I feel like people will get, so because now when you get really old, and then that's when usually it'll be
Sure,
like,
so,
I don't know how to explain that.
yeah, I'm gonna say, put that under diversity.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it also means we'd have more women and minorities able to serve because there wouldn't be an incumbent. So we'd have more diversity. We're gonna do both. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry, I should have. Starting with first. That's corruption, right? Because if you're not there for 30 years, less chances that the interest group can essentially buy you. I know, it's like, right. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that if they rotate like often, and you don't really expect the people to take it seriously, that they're gonna keep doing it with these different times.
Yeah. Okay, so what would be a problem with the term limit?
We have not enough time to get a certain.
Okay.
The turnover is too fast.
Absolutely. Okay. So you'd lose that experience, right? If you have to have new people being elected to committees and things like that, sure.
I feel like if there was some, they're trying to do a change, we run out of good people.
Yeah.
It would just be so easy for someone to say, like,
And the other fundamental question that gets raised, what if you actually like your representative or senator? That's a voter choice, right? If you actually like your member of Congress, you can't re-elect them. It's not really a choice for the voters at that point, right? You lose that ability to say, this person's done a really good job, we want to keep sending them back. What about preference? Yeah.
good stuff, but it's like, it's good knowledge that we need and
Yeah.
we do need diversity.
Yeah. Yeah. Less corruption, ultimate choice, increased group. Not as powerful, right? Because they can't, basically just keep going to the same person over and over and over again. They'd have to reestablish those relationships. So it wouldn't be as easy for them to basically buy Congress member. Okay, so just keeping those in mind, do you think term limits are a good idea? No, that's fair. That's fair. Yeah.
I wouldn't really say, I can't say yes or no.
Yeah.
Like, you can see it goes on
I
right
think
now.
it's okay the way that they
Yeah.
did it.
Yeah.
I think the way it's set up, I like it.
Yeah.
I mean, if it comes to that point in our future, I'm sure there might be that vote one day. But right now,
I think it's okay with the
Yeah. And the argument is made if you don't like your member of Congress, you can replace them, right? That's one of the arguments against term limits is you really don't like them. You can choose not to re-elect them. I think it would be a good idea because of the way our districts are set up now. If we actually did go to created based on geography and all elections were competitive, then I wouldn't say we should have term limits. But because it's so easy for senator to get reelected at the age of 84 right now because of elections, that's kind of why I'm like, yeah, maybe term limits aren't a bad idea.
kind of this day is when it is because they've been friends for so long.
And
it's hard to run and they're not ready to take the whole changing of our world.
yeah,
And they're still in office, so we're going to stay with those conservative until they die because of how old they are.
well, and part of it too is, yeah, I mean, like you look at Dianne Feinstein from California, she was reelected at the age of like 82 or 83. And she's going to be in office until she's about like 90. And you just look at that and you're like, how does that make sense? Honestly, I think she is going downhill a little bit. But, and honestly, we could use fresh blood in Congress. We could use younger people in Congress. Right. Yeah.
And it looks like they're going to change that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, because it's like, okay, when Dianne Feinstein was coming of age, you could work the minimum wage and afford housing. Now you can't. You could get a job right after high school and buy a house. You can't, right? Even after college, most people can't afford to buy a house right away. What she grew up with looks nothing like today. Yeah. Barely. Yeah, yeah. I think some of them have lost perspective. So it's kind of why I do favor term limits because then.
How did you point that out?
I
know.
Yeah.
It's because I don't know.
No, and that's why you're in this class. Yeah. But for me, I think if we were going to institute term limits, there is a change I would make. 2 years in the House is not long enough to get anything done. It should be 4 years in the House of Representatives. Yeah. Yeah. Give them 4 years. And even if we didn't put in term limits, we should give the House 4 years, 2 years. You get elected and then you have to start running for re-election again. It's just, it doesn't make sense. It's not enough time to get anything done. Yeah.
So there's, at this moment, you also want to have the can you be elected or not? Like, I mean, because you, I don't see what you like to kind of like, would you like to be elected?
Yeah, yeah. I would want at least for the House, I'd say maybe it's 4 years, 4 terms. Doesn't have to be consecutive for 4 terms. And the Senate 3 terms because that's 18 years. And I mean, you can get a lot done in 18 years. You don't necessarily need to be there for like 50 years. Yeah. So it is. Yeah. I mean, people don't necessarily think about it, but yeah. I mean, we've had people who have been in the Senate since the 1970s. Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. But yeah, I mean, I can see the pros and cons. I think for me, the biggest con is that voters wouldn't be able to re-elect someone. But I'm not sure that outweighs the benefit of allowing for more women, more minorities, less rich people to be serving in Congress. So yeah, I can see both. I can see both. Yeah, yeah, and that's understandable. All right, we have an election on Tuesday. I don't think we'll know who won, but we have an election on Tuesday. So next Tuesday, we're going to discuss the presidency. I set aside next Thursday to discuss the election. If we don't know who won, if it's still like we don't know what's going on, I'll do a lecture on the making of the mock presidency instead. But if we actually know the results, then we can have a discussion on what we saw happening. To read chapter 13 for Tuesday. If you haven't voted yet, make sure you vote. Stay safe on Halloween if you do anything. Remember that your papers are due on the 10th. And if you weren't here at the beginning for attendance, come see me for a minute. Otherwise,